Welcome, everyone. Thank you for being here. My name is Mallory Newell. I am the project director for the Multiple Measures Assessment Project with the RP Group. I'm also the director of institutional research and planning at De Anza College. And I am joined by two of my colleagues on the Multiple Measures Assessment Project team. Loris, you want to introduce yourself first?
Hi, I'm Loris Fagioli. I'm the director of research at Irvine Valley College and part of the team.
Hi, everybody. Good afternoon. My name is Lauren Ilano. I'm a senior researcher with the RP group and also part of the team.
So today we are going to be focusing on actually a few new reports that we have. And they're really taking a deep dive and a look at the impact of AB 705 as a policy. So we now have 5 full years of data to explore. The law was fully implemented in fall 19. And the main premise of the law was really to increase access to transfer level English and math, and increase completion of transfer level English and math within 1 year of first attempting it. So we also call that rate the throughput rate. So we're looking at both access and completion or throughput for AB 705. And then we're also looking at special population groups and disabled student groups by disability status and looking at how the law has impacted their completion and access. And then we're also going to be looking at longer term outcomes now that more time has passed, which include attainment of degree and transfer outcomes. So that's what we're going to be covering today. So again, please use the Q&A to enter any questions in as we get going. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Lauren, and she's going to start us off on our direct enrollment and throughput.
Great. Thank you so much, Mallory. So today I'm going to share updated findings from our descriptive analyses on the status of direct enrollment and throughput and transfer level English and math. So we have a couple of new reports, as Mallory mentioned, and we'll put those links into the chat. And so we have one kind of statewide brief that looks at access and completion in both transfer level math and English, as well as 2 briefs that dive deeper into transfer level access and completion for our DSPS students, disaggregated by primary disability type, and another brief that looks at some of our special population student groups. So today I'm going to be giving kind of the high level overview of the general highlights across all 3 of those reports, but I encourage you to check them out. Okay, so just to level set, our cohorts were created by looking at the first math or English course a student enrolled in between fall 2015 and 2023. So for example, if a student took their first math course at a community college in fall 2018, they would be included as part of our 2018-2019 math cohort, regardless of if they took a general education course in art history or something in 2015. So we're basing our cohorts on a student's initial enrollment in either English or math. So for our first outcome, direct enrollment, we really wanted to know what percentage of students who started in a math or English pathway did so in a transfer level course, and we looked at that over time. And then from there, we looked at throughput, where we tracked all students from their first attempt in math or English to determine whether they were able to complete a transfer level course within 1 year of starting in the discipline, regardless of where they started on that sequence. So whether they started on transfer level or below transfer level. So those are our 2 outcomes. And what we found is, as you can see here from our first graph, which depicts direct enrollment and transfer level coursework, is that for our latest cohort of students, those who began in English or math in the 23-24 academic year, is essentially now everybody is starting in transfer level English and math. So access to transfer level coursework is now essentially universal across both math and English. And what we also see is that the blue line here is representing English and the yellow line represents math. And so what we see for the 2019-2020 cohort, which coincided with the full implementation of AB 705, there was an upswing in the proportion of students starting directly in transfer level courses. Since that time, math has kind of lagged behind English a little bit for the last couple of cohorts, but as of the 23-24 math cohort, the intention of the AB 705 policy that all students begin in transfer level coursework has essentially been realized. Great. So what happens when we look at throughput? So when we look at throughput, which again is the completion of that transfer level course within 1 year of starting in the discipline, we see that overall we've made great progress in both English and math. Since the 2015-2016 cohort, our throughput rates have increased steadily in both disciplines. And what we also see is that between the 2018-2019 cohorts and the 2019-2020 math cohorts is that the throughput rates jumped up almost 16 percentage points in math statewide. So that's huge. However, what we have noticed in our analysis is that the one-year throughput rates for the past few cohorts of students have begun to level out in both English and math. So what happens when we look at race and ethnicity and disaggregate? So what we do know from previous research is that students of color disproportionately have started in remedial education or below transfer level coursework. But what we can see is that in our latest cohorts, these equity gaps have all closed in both math and English. So as of our most recent cohort, the 23-24 cohorts, we are no longer seeing any equity gaps in access to transfer level math and English across any of the race and ethnicity groups that we looked at, which is great. So now when we look at throughput rates, however, these equity gaps unfortunately continue to persist. So for our Latina and African American and Black students who are represented in these graphs by the gray and the green lines respectively, what we see is that their throughput rates in both math and English still lag behind their peers and are much lower than their peers. So in this respect, AB 705 could be considered like a rising tide in that it lifted all of the throughput rates for all groups, but more work needs to be done in order to close those equity gaps that we continue to see in both math and English for our underrepresented groups. And so I mentioned earlier, we have a report on our special population students. And so our brief that looks at kind of access and throughput rates for our special population students looks deeper at the groups listed here. And so I encourage you to check that out. But just kind of overall, what we're seeing is the same thing that we're seeing statewide and with race and ethnicity with respect to access to transfer level coursework. So what we're seeing is that for all of the special population groups we looked at, their students have universal access to transfer level courses. There is a little bit more variation over the past couple of years in math, but as of the 23-24 math cohort, those gaps have closed. And then for our next slide, we look at these special population groups and the throughput rates. And so what we can see is that since the 2015-2016 cohorts across both English and math, the throughput rates have been increasing steadily, although there are still cases of disproportionate impact among the groups. And in fact, what we do see is that the gaps in the throughput rates in math in particular seem to be widening, particularly for our foster youth who are represented in the above graph with the yellow line. But for each group, to be clear, the throughput rates have increased significantly since the 2015-2016 cohort, but it is concerning that there are potentially equity gaps growing in math for our special populations groups. And then finally, we also have one additional brief that looks at students by their primary disability categories. So we disaggregated the DSPS students. And what we're finding here is that similar to our findings for race and ethnicity and special populations, throughput rates have been increasing for students across all primary disability groups. However, equity gaps continue to exist between groups on the basis of primary disability. So I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to Loris, who will talk about some new research that we've done looking at outcomes beyond one-year throughput.
Thank you, Lauren. I did want to address a couple questions in the chat. Oh, Loris has been answering quite a few of them. Thank you. Did we disaggregate the data by STEM versus non-STEM? So we have not disaggregated the data by STEM and non-STEM in this most recent report, but the throughput dashboard, the statewide throughput dashboard, does disaggregate by STEM, statistics, and calculus start. So you can do that on the state chancellor's website, and we can put that link in the chat as well. Yeah, so there's just a question about like the cohort sizes and how many colleges. So these results are out of full reports. And so we'll drop those in the chat again so that you can access those and you can see all of the counts and all of the numbers associated with how many colleges and how many students in each of these reports. And then there's just a question about throughput and how the definition is completed. So it's successful completion of the transfer level course from your first enrollment. So say if you're looking at throughput in math, regardless of what level math you start, your first entry in the discipline and then completion of the transfer level course within 1 year, right? All right, so I think that addresses most of the questions. So there is a question that we get a lot about drops before census. pre and post. And we do get this question so much that we're actually working on a brief right now with the statewide academic senate on considerations for drop data, because one of the issues with drop data, as many, in the research field know, is that drops are not a valid student record. So a student doesn't get a grade, colleges don't get paid for students who drop. A lot of times research offices or institutions don't retain drop data because it can be really huge files for students dropping for many, many reasons, from first day of registration all the way until census. So we have not looked at drops because that data is not collected by the state chancellor's office. But for colleges that would like to look at their drop data, we encourage them to do so. And we're working on a data considerations brief for that. So thank you for that question. All right, so I'll go ahead and give the remote to Loris. And you should be able, all right, Loris, do you have ability to advance?
I think so.
Okay.
All right. So this was a fun analysis, which is the first, and we will revisit this as more data comes in, even though 2018 sounds like a long time ago. But if you think about interesting outcomes that I think a lot of us are interested in, such as completion of a degree, transfer rates, they take a long time to actually come to fruition because of lags in data reporting. So we do not know if a student transferred typically a year after they've transferred. So if you give a student 2 or 3 years for enrollment, and then you have to wait an additional year until you know if that student transferred, there is always kind of data delays that we have in order to look at these long-term outcomes. So this is our first attempt at looking at these long-term outcomes, although we will update it as more data comes in, especially the post-AB 705 cohorts, the more post-AB 705 cohorts data come in. As you saw in Lauren's graphs, is that there is a steep incline, but there is every year there is an increase in throughput, and then it kind of levels off. So until we have essentially the leveled off data for those cohorts, these numbers that I will present might change over time. All right. Oh, I think that went twice. No? All right, so here's just a quick background on this analysis. And so some of this is a little bit research-based, but I encourage anybody to ask questions, and I'll try to keep this as simple as possible. But here are some baseline information for those who are interested in how these research questions are sometimes addressed. So first of all, we have a very large data set. So we have close to 3.4 million student records between 2012 and 2023. Similar to the way Lauren described it, we assign a student in a sequence based on their first enrollment. However, in this instance, the cohorts are defined as the cohort when a student's first enrollment in the system is. So you can differentiate between first enrollment in the system and first enrollment in the sequence. The report and the link that we have in the PowerPoint, and then we hopefully can also post in the chat, you have both results. And both results are very similar. The trends stay the same, but if you're interested in the difference between first enrollment in the sequence and first enrollment in the system, you can look at it at the specific report. So we look at these outcomes, or we only present these. The report has a little bit more information there, is the transfer level English or math completion within 1 year of entry, the attainment of transfer and associate's degree within 2 years, and the outcomes by race and ethnicity by high school preparation. The report has many more. So we have 1 year outcomes, 2 year outcomes, 3 year outcomes, and we have different disaggregations. So the report is much more complete, but for this presentation, we just want to pick out a couple that you might be interested in. The results stay very, very similar. The trends, if you look at the trends, they're the same, although the trends might go up. If you look at 2 or 3 year outcomes, obviously, if you give a student longer to complete, then typically the rates go up, but it's essentially a parallel trend, as you will see in the report. We will also look at 3 different time points. We call it the baseline, where maybe less innovation has happened across the system, even though maybe some innovation happened at the college level. System-wide, there were very little system-wide changes. So we use this as our baseline. Then we have a transition phase, and this is before AB 705. As many of you know, starting around 2015, there was a lot of innovation in the system with acceleration, with multiple measures, with GPA, with placement changes, including AB 705. So there was kind of a lot of transitions, and a lot of colleges started implementing certain innovations even before the law required it. And then obviously the law happened as well. And then I think after 2019, we call this the post-implementation, where everybody was required to adhere to the past law. In addition, we will present adjusted rates, and this is important for statistical reasons to account for alternative hypotheses. Alternative hypotheses are essentially reasons why the results that you're seeing could not be true or be due to something else. And so we try to adjust or control for as much as we can that we know also explains the outcomes. And you will see on the next slide all the things that we account for. So let's say you would see a big change from one year to the next in terms of the age of students that come to your college, then maybe the changes in outcomes are not due to AB 705, but due to the age of the students that enrolls in your college. So that's why we add age as a control, so that we equalize the results based on age. And obviously it's not just age, there is many different controls. And so here are some that we use. So it's gender, age, race, ethnicity, ed goal, socioeconomic status, first generation status, foster youth, and special population status. We also include high school GPA information. So for instance, could it be that we have higher throughput rates just because we have students with higher GPAs coming? So we used to get students with GPA of 2.0, and now we're getting students with GPAs of 3.0. Is that the reason? So that's why we add high school GPA as a control to equalize those differences between cohorts. Also, highest completed math and English and high school graduation are added as control. We've also added full college implementation. So if a college has essentially placed all their students or enrolled all their students at the transfer level. And also COVID flags, we're trying to control for some of COVID-19 fully online terms. So if a student was fully online during COVID, that is one additional control that we try to adjust for. All right, drum roll. So here it is. So these are the adjusted means. I also want to make that clear again. So these might not be exactly the same number as you've seen with the raw effects that Lauren presented. So we control or adjust the throughput rate here in this case to equalize across all the cohorts, all these demographic descriptors that we have. And we do that in order to see, did AB 705 actually have an effect? And so this is where you can now explain. We probably didn't explain every single possible, but the most reasonable and the most explained reasons for something to explain the changes in throughput, we've tried to control for. And here you see that still controlling for all these things, you have a huge difference between, like for English completion in the baseline, you have 26%, and then went all the way up to 50%. In math, it went from 12 to 33%. And math and English went from 6% to 19%. So those are extremely large effect sizes. In research, it's very difficult to find means that explain or can move the needle dramatically. And this here is one of the few times where we do see this had a huge effect on student completion. In this case, the transfer level English or math within 1 year. And again, the report has 2-year and 3-year timeframes as well. And the trends are exactly the same. Even you look at 2-year and 3-year timeframes, the changes from baseline to post-implementation are always higher. The graphs just are maybe at a different rate. Now, this is already, I think, what everybody has kind of seen in many of our presentations in the dashboard, and also what Lauren showed. So I think this should not come as a big surprise. So this here is also essentially what Lauren showed, just adjusted rates. So we see that AB 705 has benefited all students. So this change from baseline to post-implementation has benefited all racial categories. However, as Lauren said, the equity gap still persists. But from a student perspective, if you look at African American or Hispanic Latino students, that has a huge impact on them completing math and English at a higher rate and much quicker compared to the past. Here is the same thing for math completion, still very dramatic changes. If you look at the blue bar compared to the gray bar, these are huge changes for students who have historically had very low rates of access to transfer level and completion of transfer level. These have now dramatically increased. And here is the English and math. So obviously these are lower because it's a fairly short time frame, right? So 1 year from start of enrollment is a very short time frame. But we do know from guided pathways and from a lot of other research that completing math and English in the first year is one of the strongest predictor of completion and transfer. And as you will see in our next slide, this is also holds true. So completion of math and English within 1 year is a high benchmark to achieve. And we see that AB 705 has moved the needle in that regard. And here you see it broken out by high school GPA. Obviously, high school GPA is a big predictor of success also at the college level. And you see that even for students with the lowest high school GPAs, it has benefited them in terms of completion. Granted, these completion rates are lower for low GPA students compared to high GPA students, but compared to the baseline, the AB 705 has improved it also for low GPA students.
While you're on high school GPA, there's a question around where we source our high school information from.
Yes. So for this analysis, we have used self-reported high school GPA data. Our reports from past years have sometimes used data directly from the high schools. And we have done quite a lot of analyses that seem that the trends and the analyses that we find both from direct data from high school data as well as self-reported data find very similar results. And hopefully moving forward, we will have access to direct data again, and we are working on that as well. But these ones that you're seeing right now are based on self-reported data.
From the CCC Apply application.
All right. So, and I think this is what probably many of you were hoping to see is kind of the longer term outcomes. And this is, I think, the new contribution of this report is we know that it has had an impact on throughput, but what about long-term implications? And so here you see the effect that it had on transfer and of completion of an associate's degree. So you see it pretty much doubled the transfer rate of 2 years. Again, 2 years is a very short time frame for transfer. As we know, you can only transfer within 2 years, essentially, if you're a full-time student. So this underestimates the effect for part-time students. And so as we get more data in, we will also do it with 3 and 4 year timeframes to see how part-time students are affected by that as well. But this clearly had a very dramatic effect of transfer for primarily full-time enrolled students. Completion of associate's degree is fairly low. As many of you know, many of our students leave the institution even though they might have completed a degree, even though they have not applied for the degree. So this is expected to be lower than the actual transfer rate, although even there, it seems that completing math and English at a higher rate gives the student a higher chance of also completion of an associate's degree. These rates we look at also for 3 and 4, as I mentioned in the report, and as we move forward, hopefully longer term outcomes as well. But overall, this is quite dramatic. If you think about it, there is very few levers that you can apply as an institution that has such a dramatic effect on the completion and long-term completion of your students. And here, the same thing. So what about transfer on ethnicity? Now look at these numbers. So if you look at African American and Hispanic Latine students for transfer, and now again, these are primarily full-time enrolled students that are able to transfer. This is pretty much a doubling of the effect across the board, which is quite dramatic. If you have twice the chance of transferring compared to before, that is a fairly significant impact if you are a student and you're enrolled and you have double the chance of transferring now compared to just a few years ago. These are the associate's degree completions. And as I mentioned, not all students complete a degree even though they transfer. So these rates are quite dramatically lower than the transfer rates, but even those have strongly improved. Many ways have tripled the effect of completing an associate's degree. And similarly, transfer for broken out by GPA. Again, we do see what we would expect. Obviously, higher GPA students have a much higher chance of completing a degree and or transferring. But the important takeaway is the gray bars are still higher than the blue bars for all subgroups. And here also for the degree attainment. So AB 705 has reduced barriers to English and math course required for transfer and associate's degree. There was a universal direct enrollment and transfer English and math achieved for all groups. There is very significant and large improvements in throughput and transfer level English math completions within 1 year, and increases in transfer level English and math completion with 1 year, and attainment of transfer and associate's degree within 2 years after first CCC enrollment. We do have more work to do related to equity gaps that we still see, and we will update again these results as well with longer term outcomes that will also account for part-time enrolled students with 3 and 4 year outcomes and timeframes.
I'm going to go ahead and stop share for a minute so that I can give Lauren the ability to share some links. And then if you have any questions, I'll go ahead and let's see if we have any in the chat that you could respond to. All right, thank you. So Lauren's dropping some links into the chat for everybody of the long-term outcomes, the full report. And Lauren, I have the access and enrollment links. I can go ahead and grab those and put those in the chat as well. So I'll drop those in so you can grab them. They're also on the Measures Assessment Project webpage. If anyone has any particular questions, you want to raise your hand. I see, Loris, there's a couple questions in there. I don't know if you want to answer any of them live.
Are you responding to the one, Lauren? I saw you were typing, but I don't know if you want to take it. We should answer that live.
Yeah, why don't you answer it live? Sorry. Got it.
All right, so there's a question about, baseline years, if it includes below transfer enrollment. And yes, that includes. So if we are looking at a 1 year time frame for math and English completion, if a student, let's say in 2015, was enrolled 3 levels below in math, it essentially precluded them from completing math in 1 year, right? So 1 year is a very short time frame, but we do know that first year enrollment in math and completing math is essentially the standard. And so that does mean that the rates for pre-AB 705 and pre-multiple measures implementations, those rates are much lower because it essentially eliminates the chance of a student even completing math within 1 year. However, you can now see in the report that the same holds true regardless of what time frame you're looking at. If you're looking at 2 year or 3 year time frame, so you're giving students 3 years to complete math, the same holds true. So limiting the time frame to a 1 year time frame does not change the effect or the results of pre-AB 705 and post-AB 705 throughput rates, typically doubled or tripled for especially math and English completion.
And I will upload the PowerPoint into the chat too, because there's a request to get the slides. So I'll go ahead and do that now and find it very messy.
There's another one. If the percent increased, does that mean that the numbers increased? We typically show percents because, as you know, enrollments fluctuate, especially during COVID, post-COVID, our numbers go up and down. So if you only look at the number of completions, then they sometimes fluctuate just because you have lower enrollments. But if you look at our completion dashboard, you see that the completion, the raw numbers, the number of students completing have risen dramatically as well. Sometimes, especially during COVID numbers, sometimes they go down a little bit just because you might have overall as a system, we've lost a lot of students. Sometimes we have, 10, 20, 30% enrollment declines. And so by default, if you have fewer students enrolling, then you have fewer students completing. And that's why you sometimes look at the rates. But yes, both hold true. We have many more students. So the volume of students completing is dramatically higher as well as the rates.
All right, so I did load the PowerPoint into the chat, and then thank you, Lauren, for putting up the dashboard.
Yes, please take a look at the dashboard and give us feedback if you see anything that you see that you want to question or that you have questions about. We're happy to answer those. There is the STEM and non-STEM throughput as well. So you can look at your throughput to pre-calculus or your throughput to calculus or your throughput to statistics. So there are those differentiations. The one feedback we have gotten related to the STEM throughput is there is one desire to differentiate between calculus STEM and business STEM, business calculus, so STEM calculus and business calculus differentiation. Unfortunately, it is not possible for us to differentiate between those two. We have to combine STEM calculus with business calculus in the methodology. So the methodology that we're taking for the STEM dashboard is that we're going completely by behavior, meaning we're only looking at enrollments of students and we're assigning a student to statistics or STEM based on their enrollment. And if a student enrolls in college algebra, we don't know if we assign that student to the STEM calculus bucket or to the business calculus bucket. So it's very difficult for us to differentiate a student's trajectory based purely on their enrollment, because their educational goals and majors sometimes change, the self-reported or the reported ed goal, especially the data that we receive at the state level, does not seem to be a very good indicator. So if you are interested in kind of business or STEM calculus disaggregations, unfortunately, we hope that your local college or your local research offices can help you. Sometimes they have slightly more nuanced and better data there as well. If you truly want to differentiate that, it's slightly challenging at the state level. So for the dashboard, that is the only caveat. We cannot differentiate the business calculus throughput, so it will be combined with the STEM calculus throughput. But you can at least differentiate between statistics and the B-STEM side.
All right, I'm not seeing any more questions. I will go ahead and give you the gift of 20 minutes back in your day. Thank you all for being here. Thank you to Loris and Lauren for presenting. Thank you to all the members of the Multiple Measure Assessment Project team who weren't joining us today, and to the State Chancellor, Community College Chancellor's Office for funding the project as well. Thank you everyone for being here. And again, we'll have the recording posted to the Multiple Measure Assessment Project webpage. And we hope that you have a lovely rest of your day. Thank you.